Rather than focusing on, the existing state of financial markets and whether or not the articles or advertisements, you don't really kind of get a very good overview and a very good spotlight on the correct things to focus on. So we're going to start there, and I'm going to go quickly. This is not going to be by any means, the end all, but we'll try to get on it and get to the highlights, from my perspective. And you'll see YouTube video over the next couple of weeks on it as well. So anyway, let's go to the definition. What's an annuity? An annuity is basically a financial contract. And the financial contract works in the following, which is that you deposit money on day one. Now, you can choose, there are a number of different types of annuities. I'm going to talk about the first type, which is SPIA, Single Premium Immediate Annuity. What this does, this turns your pot, let's just call it 100. You deposit 100 on day one. A Single Premium Index Immediate Annuity, SPIA, turns it into lifetime income, period. That's it. In other words, you receive X dollars out of the 100 forever. So you can understand its obvious reason, which is the traditional pension, the one that your grandparents may have had, that is now gone. Basically gone. The number of them, that is now gone the way of the Brontosaurus. Instead, 401k, IRA, you have a balance that goes up and down. There can be matching by your employers, for example, in the 401k, 403b. But that doesn't mean that they're turning it into a lifetime income stream. You're left to manage it. Well, a SPIA does this for you. There are a number of different payout options, and we're not going to get into it right now. And the reason is because this is not really that central to the understanding. The general principle is that the function of the SPIA is to create a lifetime income flow. The second type is going to be called variable annuity. So and variable annuity and deferred indexed annuities, we're going to call them the same for today. And I know that's going to be, a shortcut because we could have separate podcasts for variable annuity. But really what I'm talking about is what makes annuities work as a whole. Annuities work as a whole because of the tax deferral element, right? Which means that you deposit 100, this pot, and from then the crediting, the ups and downs of the mark to market or the valuation of your annuity contract is not subject to tax. Now, this also implies the following, which is that generally speaking, it is not a great idea to put monies from pre-tax money into annuities. And there's your reason, right? Which is that since the money is being accumulated inside the vehicle itself on a tax-free basis, that means why would you also take your money, which is pre-tax to begin with, into that type of vehicle, since it can grow outside that vehicle in a pre-tax fashion? Well, there are limitations that, and you can find advice or you could find videos that say don't ever put your deferred or your 401k money into an annuity. That's also not the case, right? Because the practical reality, and this is very, very important, right? The practical reality is that if a huge amount or a large portion of your money sits in deferred accounts, if they sit in your 401k, your IRA, and that's the bulk of your lifetime savings, then you would have to, right? So this is what I don't like about kind of, these extreme statements that get me made, in order to get clicks, which is that, never ever this or never ever that. You just can't say never ever. And there's your example, because a lot of people face this situation where the deferred account is much bigger than the already, non-qualified funds, post-tax money. In which case, putting, the good stuff about annuity, the fact that you might want to have to create a lifetime income stream, et cetera, or may want to have other features that we're going to talk about later in this podcast, it may not be doable with your post-tax money in your non-qualified account, and non-qualified meaning post-tax. It just doesn't work. So as a result, you may have no choice but to, and by no choice, this is not a negative. What I'm saying is it may be the most practical to use your qualified funds, an example being your IRA, your 401k. So again, it's just another example of never say never. On we go. So now let's just talk about how annuities work once you've deposited the money in. Okay? What actually goes on in there. And now we'll go to deferred indexed annuities. So you put $100 in, or 100 units in, whatever the amount. What goes on? Well, inside, one very positive feature is the balance is protected from downside. Now it's protected from downside, and that the reason is that once you allocate monies, then and let's just, rather than getting into what the different, indexes or whatever the markets are, et cetera, or your allocations are, let's just call it A, B, and C. So the point is that your total balance can be protected from downside. Now, is that always the case? The answer to that is not strictly. There can be adjustments. What are those adjustments? Let's just say you allocated 30 into selection B. Well, selection B could have something called market value adjustment, which does change with interest rates. Okay. And that each of them, there's a fee. There's a fee for putting the money into the annuity. Right? So right away, your 100 doesn't get 100. Now it's counterbalanced by your returns of A, B, and C. But it's also wrong to say, well, your 100 never declines. There's no never here. You would have to go to contract by contract. That said, there is substantial protection. For example, if selection A is equities, stocks, then what you can see is that depending on the selection you choose, it can be protected from the downside. And I'll swerve here just quickly. How do they do this? Well, they do this because inside of selection A, they have bought in, portfolio insurance, which is, and for, derivative traders, this is, something called a put option on that portfolio so that your value in selection A does not decline. Now, can you do this at home? Yeah. I mean, in theory, it's possible. You can do it. You can buy actually this portfolio protection from a broker. Can you actually practically manage it? I doubt it. Meaning that, the number of people out there that can actually have the information, technology, keep up to date, understand how a put option works, and then actually manage it, very, very unlikely. So on we go, because there are certain things that annuities do not do. So now let's just go back to the 100, and it's been allocated to A, B, and C. The fact is that it is very, very unlikely that your 100 will outperform your buddy across the street who's all in on stock market over time, right? In other words, what I'm saying is, remember I told you just a few moments ago that there are certain elements that have protected B from the downside? The thing you're giving away is you're also giving away the upside. That's the counterbalance here, right? I mean, this protection that I talked about, that's not costless, right? There's a cost to it. There's a market for it in the real world. So the fact of the matter is your upside will be limited. And there's a bunch of language that explains what those limitations will be. The kicker here on what annuities don't do is that, I've just said that the upside is limited. It's limited based on the language in each annuity contract. Each annuity contract has its own special, non-standardized language. That means that if you bought an annuity from company number 1 and it has a selection list A, B, C, well, company number 2 will have its own selection list, which is letters K, L, M, and N. And even if A, B, and C look like K, L, M, and N, that does not mean they are exactly the same. And here is the challenge, one of many challenges that people who are interested in annuities have to deal with. Candid reality. Do I think you can handle this by yourself? No. Because the differences in this fact that A, B, and C are not the same as K, L, M, and N, those differences are big. Let's talk about some of those limitations. And I'm not going to say A, B, or C, or I'm not going to say K, L, M, and N, but what types of restrictions are there? Number 1, there can be something called participation rate, meaning if the stock market goes up by 10%, you go up by 4%, something like that. That's called participation rate. There can be absolute caps. And by caps, what I mean is any part of these selections, A, B, C, K, L, M, and N, that in any period that your amount that you can make or that you'll be credited with can be limited by a certain number, which will be in writing, by the way. This is not hocus pocus. They're not going to make it up after the fact. It has to be in writing. There are resets. And by resets, what I mean is timing. So what happens is you deposit 100 on day 1, and then you're going to have selection C, let's just say. And let's just say you can choose to elect 50% of 100, so 50, into selection C. Well, C will have a reference number. So let's just call it 305. And that's where the stock market index, according to its definition, is. And then it goes up to 310. Well, you're going to take certain snapshots in time, and that is the reset. So some companies, this is, annually, quarterly, semi-annually. Again, the companies get to tell you what their definition is. Importantly here, inside of A, B, C, K, L, M, and N, is that it looks like you're investing in equity markets or stock markets to some degree. There's a very, very important distinction here, which is that under most, in fact, I have never seen a stock related index, right? So A, B, C, K, L, M, and N, it may say, that you get to mimic the S&P 500. You don't get the dividends, which also means you don't get the compounding effect of the fact that the dividends. This is an important thing. All you get is the price difference of the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones. Now, this is not trivial, right? Which is that 2%, let's just call that the yield, or that's your dividend rate on the S&P 500. Well, 2% may not seem like much in a year, but if you leave it in there for 10 years and then compound it, now you're talking about 20% plus the effect of compounding. So it can be a big number. So you need to be careful. And this is part of the reason that we go back to this section, which is that the idea that no matter what your allocation, A, B, C, K, L, M, and N. It doesn't even matter what your percentages are there. It is going to be very difficult to outperform equity markets in up markets. So your friend across the street tells you my 100 turned into 150 over 10 years. You're not likely to be anywhere close to 150 after that same time period. Let's get to the positive and negatives. I'll start with the positives. So I've already mentioned the first couple. One, which is the tax deferral benefit of this, meaning that the gains and losses are protected from income tax while inside the annuity. That's clear. The second one is that in the single premium indexed immediate annuity, SPIA, you can get a lifetime income that never expires. Now, this is very important because, and this is what stockbrokers don't really tell you about. And this is why they try to spin it negative. It's actually a positive for annuities, which is that your broker and you are unlikely to be able to, no, not unlikely. They can't guarantee this. They just cannot. We can say that, oh, well, in the long run, that stocks are higher, and so your balance will be higher, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, okay. 2020 is proving to you that it's not a guarantee. And the fact is that an annuity, by creating an income stream, is a cash flow that can't be replicated by your broker advisor. And if they're explicitly guaranteeing it to you, you should squint pretty hard because that's a promise that shouldn't be made. And no matter what, this is the source of problems here, right? Because the broker is motivated. In addition to that, you can't tell as a consumer, right? Because the person is getting fees as a result. He's motivated by, money management fees, for example, to tell you that annuities are bad. But the reality is, as a consumer, I always tell financial planning clients, always, I said, look, you're trying to figure out what function the financial instruments are playing in your life, right? And the fact is, the function of the annuity can be so great that you give up the fun and excitement of investing in stocks and, opening up your brokerage account. And you can't get away from that. What ends up happening is that the negatives to annuities that you hear by brokers, and they call it annuicide, right? Well, yeah, it's annuicide because their fees have gone down and the money has walked out the door when you put it into the deposit of an annuity. Yeah. But the reality is that to the consumer's priority may be that they need to have a higher layer of income, which they can't outlive, much like, in other words, to augment Social Security benefits, for example. And in addition to that, of course, the one other thing that would lead to the third big positive, which is, in a married couple, you can make this as joint life, meaning second to die. What doesn't have that? Social Security, where you do not get 2 Social Security checks when the first spouse predeceases the second. So that's the wrap on the positives, and the takeaway here is, don't get away from the objective of what the annuity is to do. Because the objections to it, which are going to be real, I'm going to point out the negatives. I've already mentioned some of the complications, right? One of those is the negatives being as they're complicated. But that doesn't override the fact that the huge positive may be for you and your situation in order to create the stability which can be liquidated and which you can never outlive. That you need to determine how important that function is to you. Because if the function is super important, then I tell persons, okay, now we need to bite the bullet, and now we need to go through the weeds and get through the negatives to find the best solution, right? Get the best solution so that we can focus back on what its actual function is. The issue is that people get distracted. People get distracted from the fundamental function of what the annuity is to do. And as a result, they get distracted by the complicated, descriptions I had for A, B, C, K, L, M, and N. And it's actually more complicated than that, not less complicated than I've described. None of that stuff matters if you absolutely positively need to have an extra higher layer of income, and that is more important in your personal priority list. Sorry. And no matter what your broker tells you, this is a place that I tell consumers, look, this is a place you can put your foot down. That's your money. You and only you determine its importance and its function into your daily life or whatever your priority list would be. Candidly, from that point, only once that is established, then the pieces come into place. All right, so now let's talk about the negatives. And I did touch on it, right? And I spent quite a few moments about it, right? Which is that you've now deposited 100, and now you're going to have to allocate into A, B, C, or K, L, M, and N. Okay, and I've told you that there are lots of different sellers. There are many different sellers, all with different letters. And those letters may look the same. They are not exactly the same. You're going to have to get through the idea that you need to look through the language. There's no shortcut to it. Should a private person do it without an expert opinion? My biased opinion, right, is that the answer to that is no. You aren't trained. You aren't trained to see what the hooks are. You're not trained to see what the scenarios look like. Unfortunately, I have to share with you that insurance agent number 75 in Timbuktu may also not. The reason for my extreme bias here is because I've been part of the contract writing process. So I know that A, B, and C are very subtly different from K, L, M, and N. So that's the first one. The second one is that, again, that the returns inside as a result of these nuances, as a result of the fact that they're protecting you from the downside, is that annuities are very unlikely to beat financial markets over the long run. And again, this has to go back to what's its function. If you're fixated on the function of the money to grow because you need to have 100 turn into 200 in 10 years, annuities aren't going to do it, period. They're not. You're not going to be able to call me up after 10 years and say, okay, I want my 100 and my buddy turned 100 into 200. Can I have my 200? The answer is going to be no. And there's your issue, right? So again, if you focus on the function, and if that function is that you wanted the growth without the risk, that trade-off doesn't exist in financial markets. So as a result, certainly not an annuity where A, B, C, K, L, M, and N are protecting you from downside. Let's talk about mistakes. So as you can hear, I've been talking for 25 minutes at breakneck pace. And don't get me wrong, I've glossed over tons of stuff here, and I've glossed over the nitty-gritty because I want people to get the message about what they're actually doing, and also not get distracted. This is also critical. You could hear me say that, earlier. Mistake number one is to presume they're all the same. Okay, so there are tons of sellers of annuities. Single premium immediate annuity. There are 40 sellers. Easily 40 sellers. The payouts are not all the same. They're not. So depending on what your pattern of payout is, what ends up happening is somebody says, Jay, I want a SPIA. I'm this age. I'm a female. And what is my stream? What's my X dollars that I'm going to get every year for forever? That X is going to change from company to company, and it's not really going to be small. You need to be careful and shop. The idea that you would just go to a single seller and only look at that seller's options doesn't make sense. The number 2 mistake, and actually the much bigger picture here, is that people don't liquidate. And what this means is the following, is that if you followed up to now, what you've heard is that annuities have a very valuable function to some people. And that function is to create lifetime income that can never be interrupted. Right? Maybe you have bad spending habits. Some people want to have the extra layer of discipline. So they know that they want to put this $100 down into a coffee can and just create lifetime income. Now, under deferred indexed annuities or variable annuities, what ends up happening is you put money into the pot for some period. And then inside these contracts, you have something called a guaranteed income base. I'm going to tell you a couple things. Number one is that guaranteed income base is very likely to be better than your allocations into A, B, and C. Right? The company has said, look, I'm going to guarantee you an income base. Let's call that a reference number. That reference number at any point in time is going to be higher than A, B, C, K, L, M, or N. Almost no matter what. That's just a fact because of the way that the A, B, and C, K, L, M, and N, the language is constructed. So now you're on some guaranteed income base. The second problem here is people don't turn that into money. The way to turn that into money is to liquidate. In other words, annuitize is what they would say. In other words, turn it into the stream. Because that's an amount of money that you would not be able to access by just selling your annuity or redeeming your annuity. You will get the value as determined by A, B, and C. You will not get the guaranteed income base reference number. It's complicated here. But if you follow to now, you have 2 different numbers. You've got a reference number, which cannot be liquidated, which means you can't just redeem your annuity at that number. You cannot. You've got A, B, and C. That you can turn into cash as one redemption number. The only way to get the value from the guaranteed income base is to annuitize. This effectively converts that bigger number into a SPIA. In other words, a single premium index. I'll stop that mistake some point. Single premium immediate annuity. So it takes the higher number, which you could not otherwise monetize into cash, and turns it into lifetime income. Not doing this, that's the mistake. The reason this is a mistake is because if the objective was to create the lifetime income anyway, then you should actually do it. So what happens is someone puts the 100 on day one. They don't liquidate after 7 years, 10 years, 5 years. They don't use this higher income base, the reference number, which is much higher than A, B, and C. Because the reality is, because of the negative to annuities, which means you can't beat financial markets, right? Then you've made the mistake on day one, which is you didn't define what that money was, the role of that deposit was. I give this at every conference, at every seminar, when I talk about an individual situation, individual type of, product, long-term care, life insurance, annuity here. You need to define what you are doing with this 100. You need to define it. And then the punchline here is you need to decide, okay, this is 100 out of X hundred. Maybe it's 100 out of 900. Maybe it's 100 out of 800, depending on household to household. When you don't annuitize, when you don't liquidate the guaranteed income base, you're not getting the upside of financial markets or the risk up and down of financial markets. So what ends up happening ultimately is that people end up being unhappy with something and looking backwards and saying, well, this didn't do this or this didn't do that. Usually that is the result of the fact that people didn't define two things. Number one, they didn't define exactly what that objective was. And then number two, they didn't allocate or think through how much they were going to allocate out of their total household, resources. When you don't do that stuff first, if you don't do that work in front, then you're going to be disappointed, or you can be disappointed later. The problem is, of course, you talk to your buddy and they tell you that this, that, or the other, and it didn't do this or it didn't do that, and then I had this negative or that negative, etc., etc. Yeah, but you need to understand, and hopefully you've gotten that from this podcast, right? Which is those are distractions. Those may be distractions. Number one, it doesn't take away from the fact that there are valuable functions for some. Number two is that you need to look through the nitty-gritty, the limitations, so that you can decide whether or not it's actually appropriate for you. Number three is that once you are entered into it, can you get out? The answer is yes. Are there, excess withdrawal penalties? The answer is yes. That's actually going to be the subject of another, podcast or video. But it not so big that it got away from that it detracted from the original objective. That if the original objective was sound and if it's intact, then it will do its job. The contracts will do as written. And number two is that to address the second point is that some people may say, well, it took away from this, that, or the other. Well, that is a difference of the fact that somebody didn't allocate the appropriate amount of their household resources into products, whatever that strategy is. It's not because of, the annuity contract didn't do as it stated, or the losses were zero, but then the upside was not very much. The way to adjust that is by adjusting the allocation into other avenues, like over to your stockbroker. You've never heard anything on this podcast saying, take all of your savings and roll it into annuities. You'll never hear me say that. You won't hear me say that about any financial product, right? But the important stuff is those decisions are yours, and you can be subject to crossfire, which distracts you away from those. That's kind of my point. You can hear that similar theme across all of my podcasts, to be candid with you, videos, newsletter. It's not diversity for diversity's sake. It is not as simple as don't put all of your eggs in one basket. What it is you've got a lot of number of objectives. Every person does. They want to fulfill 5 different objectives with, the next 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. It doesn't matter what your age division is. The issue is that your allocations into these types of different avenues has to match that narrative. That's all I've got today. Switched course here into financial products because the reality is Medicare is the thinnest layer. In other words, I could have changed the terminology here today and written on each one of the segments. I could have shown you the exact same challenges and same types of problems that people face and the same types of mistake that people make under Medicare, life insurance, long-term care insurance. Doesn't matter what the financial topic is. The pattern, the types of problems that people encounter, and the types of mistakes that people make are the same. I'm trying to address that with you so that you can understand the challenges, the fact that this is not about politics. It's not about like I said, your buddy and the war story at happy hour. It has to do with your understanding. It has to do with just clear decision making and getting away from the distortion so that you can make the best decision for your priorities, which may be different from your friends. It could be different from your twin brothers. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Give it a 5-star rating on iTunes. It's not called iTunes anymore, is it? Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher. It's everywhere. I'm Jay, author of Maximize Your Medicare. Please check out the site, maximizeyourmedicare.com. Send me your questions. There's a button there that says Ask Jay. Talk with you next time.